There's a moment in every country's history when it stops pretending, when the law no longer functions as a shield for the weak but as a weapon against them, when dissent is rebranded as danger, when compassion is prosecuted as conspiracy. This episode is about that moment, told through the trials and life of one man who's dedicated himself to defending some of the most vulnerable communities in India's tribal heartland. This is the story of Kobad Gandhi. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. If you're new here at Collectively Vigilant, we learn the law through true crime. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing to this channel and also subscribe to our podcast, which is now available on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, and Google. With that being said, let's start with the story of this amazing man. Kobad Gandhi was born in 1951 in Bombay into a wealthy Parsi family. Now, for listeners who are unfamiliar with Parsis, they're a very small ethno-religious community in India who follow the Zoroastrian religion, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, originating in ancient Persia or modern-day Iran. Parsis arrived on India's western coast roughly between 8th to 10th centuries AD after fleeing conquest and religious persecution in their home country and are highly concentrated in Mumbai or Bombay. Despite their small numbers, they have become disproportionately influential in business, in law, in science, in philanthropy, especially not only during British rule, but even after that. If you've heard of this company called TCS or the Tatas, it actually originated among the Parsis of India. So, in short, being born as a Parsi in mid-20th century Bombay often meant elite education, professional networks, and insulation from the brutalities of caste and poverty that was shaping the lives of most other Indians. Kobad Gandhi's father was a senior finance executive at Glaxo, and the family lived really well and walked around in elite social circles. They had financial security, they had access to the most prestigious institutions that money could buy. And as a matter of fact, Kobad Gandhi followed this expected path. He joined the Doon school, which is often known as the Eton of India, the best school of India basically, and then attended St. Xavier's College, which is supposed to be at one point the Cambridge of India. And then he actually moved to the actual Cambridge University and landed himself in London to qualify as a chartered accountant. Everything in his life till this date pointed towards a life of corporate civility, respectability, and success. But then it didn't. He went to Britain in the late 1960s to train as a chartered accountant, which was the common route for most elite Indians of his generation. He was formally articling initially at an auditing firm of Jackson and Pixley in the city of London. He studied like everyone else, he sat for the exams, and he worked while he was training as a chartered accountant. He even did what's called wage work. He was basically a paid intern at an elite firm called Suffrages, which suggests that he was living not really a sheltered life of a student. He was actually in the deep recesses of an ordinary working professional life of London. In Britain, Kobad encountered something that his polished life had never prepared him for, and that was racism. However, racism affected him in a very unique way. It didn't just offend his morality, it radicalized him. He began attending political meetings in working class areas. He started speaking publicly against racism, and he saw this as British imperial hypocrisy. With time, Kobad's activism escalated, and during a protest, he was arrested, beaten by the police, and sentenced to prison for 3 months in Brixton. Now, the most important thing to note here is that there was absolutely no allegation of violence. He was actually a peaceful protester when he was beaten by the police and then thrown in jail. After his release, he returned to his professional track and continued studying. Then eventually he took a study leave and sat for all his chartered accountant exams. But ultimately, he resigned from Jackson and Pixley when he had only one exam pending. The firm reportedly regretted this decision, but Kobad never did. So, what happened to Kobad? Well, he did not qualify as a chartered accountant, not because he failed, but because he chose to walk away. He returned to India, and back in Bombay, he did not just slide into his elite life gently. He joined a political organization specifically known as the Progressive Youth Movement of India. And that's where he met another firebrand just like himself, a woman by the name of Anuradha Shanbag, the woman who eventually became his wife. Anuradha was as unusual for the same structural reasons as Kobad Gandhi was unusual. She had a privileged and secure life available to her, a life that she rejected consciously and completely. She was the daughter of Ganesh Shanbag, a prominent Bombay High Court lawyer known for defending communists during the Telangana struggle, and she was also the daughter of Kumud Shanbag, who was also politically very active. Anuradha was academically extremely accomplished and was educated at Elphinstone College, and later she earned an MPhil in sociology and began working as a professor. She had stability, she had respectability, and she had security. But like Hobart, she did not just drift into a life of politics out of any kind of desperation. She chose it, fully aware of everything that she was giving up. They met through left wing politics, civil liberties activism. Neither of them, as such, converted the other. They were both equally committed. They married in 1977, and even their marriage reflected something rare in radical politics. It was not any kind of rebellion just for rebellion's sake, but it was a kind of moral seriousness that comes with being Kobad and Anuradha. Kobad Gandhi reportedly asked Anuradha Shanbag's parents for their consent, and with humility, they granted their daughter to Kobad. By choosing each other, what they did separated them from political theatre. This was real commitment. They had chosen poverty. After marriage, they didn't just perform simplicity, they lived it. They moved into precarious housing into the Dalit localities of Nagpur. Then they even moved to rented accommodations in Indore. During this whole time, they had absolutely no possessions except a few books. Their income came from regular lecturing and working for civil organizations. They could have inherited wealth, but they chose to give it up. People around them described their home as containing little more than two trunks full of books and just a few glasses for water. Anuradha herself used to commute every day back and forth for the civil liberties work and for lecturing at universities on a bicycle. Kobad eventually got himself a basic moped, and for them, this was not a temporary phase. It was their entire life. Now, for anyone who's unfamiliar with what Dalit means, Dalits are communities historically treated as untouchables in India. In the Indian caste system, they're pushed aside and they're forced to do degrading labor, while systematically they have been denied dignity, education, and safety. Discrimination, though, I must say, is illegal on paper, but caste violence and exclusion remains the reality of the lives of most Dalits in India. Dalits are roughly 16 to 17% of India's population, which roughly makes them about 200 million people. Kobad and Anuradha were not just advocating for these communities from a distance, they moved into these neighborhoods. They built those relationships, they organized civil liberty movements for them. And slowly but surely, the Indian state began to take notice. By the early 1980s, Kobad Gandhi became a central committee member of the CPI People's War and later remained a central committee member when CPI Maoist, which is also a political party, was formed. Meanwhile, Anuradha's activism deepened even more. Eventually, she went underground to work in the forested regions where the tribal communities, which are called the Adivasis, live. Many of these people were repeatedly displaced by the Indian government for mining purposes, for building dams, and for other state backed development projects. These people are often not given any resettlement whatsoever or compensation. If it is given, it comes decades later. By that time, these people usually lose their only means of sustenance. Life for the Adivasis in India has been brutal. Kobad and Anuradha chose that brutal life. They chose constant movement. They chose illness. They chose malaria. They chose hunger and exhaustion. Anuradha and Kobad both refused special treatment. She began to learn local languages and spoke many of those indigenous languages fluently. She mentored young activists and she herself challenged patriarchy just by being herself, and also wrote about this movement seriously in many books. She has written some authoritative works on caste and feminism, works that remain influential even today. But after decades and decades of doing this kind of work, as you can imagine, her body kept absorbing this punishing schedule. And by the time it was April 2008, Anuradha Shanbag was diagnosed with cerebral malaria. Unfortunately, this led to her death at the age of 54. Less than 2 years later, the state came after Kobad Gandhi. Kobad Gandhi was picked up while he was in Delhi in September of 2009, and he was arrested and booked under charges which are called the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or the UAPA. And he was accused of being a senior leader of the CPI Maoist party. Many sensational charges were used to justify his incarceration, and he was put into jail for a period of 10 years from 2009 till the end of 2019. But over time, in court, the prosecution time and again failed to prove any terror related charges against Kobad Gandhi. He was eventually acquitted in the main charges which were framed against him under UAPA case, which was resolved in June of 2016. Yet he was kept in prison for 3 more years. He remained imprisoned due to many allegations under Indian Penal Code section 420 related to the use of alleged false identities, charges that functioned in practice as a legal mechanism to keep him locked up. When every time he would go to the court, the narrative that the state had built would collapse. Prison conditions that he talks about in his book. After being in jail for 10 years, Kobad Gandhi was eventually released. And that's when he wrote his autobiography, in which he discusses prison conditions and the slow violence of being an undertrial in the Indian legal system. Kobad spent nearly a whole decade in jail, mostly as an undertrial, things for which most other countries would give you a bail. He spent a bulk of that time in the Tihar jail. Then he was later transferred to the Hyderabad jail. He was also taken to the Patiala jail and kept there. He was also taken to the Jharkhand jail and kept there. And then he was also incarcerated in the Vishakhapatnam jail. From the very start, he was kept in what's called a high risk ward, which is a part of the jail which is designed to control, never to rehabilitate. The jail life that Kobad Gandhi explains in his book involved repeated strip searches, humiliating recordings, humiliating things done to him, procedures which, by all metrics around the world, are described as colonial era practices, which are still alive for some reason in independent India. He was kept under constant CCTV surveillance, which ran 24/7, sometimes positioned in ways in which the very last bit of privacy was stripped from him. Lights were kept on 24/7. His movement was heavily restricted. His access to medical care was almost nil. And this despite the fact that the Indian government knew when he was taken under custody, he was already diagnosed with cancer. His movement was restricted. His access to healthcare was none. He had to time and time again write to the courts to beg for books and writing materials. Even his legal consultations required constant permission, and sometimes those permissions were denied without any explanation. In his book, he says that this happens far too often. It's almost systematic. Transfers between jails for Kobad Gandhi were very sudden and extremely destabilizing. Often, he was not even given minimal notice, and this disrupted whatever little medical care he was being given. There are many times when he talks about in his book where he was presented to the court and the judges could see that he was so frail that he couldn't stand. And the judges immediately made sure that he could at least be given a chair to sit on while the procedures were going on. So, time and time again, he does say that some judges were very nice to him. Kobad Gandhi describes a system which is less focused on any kind of justice, but it's a system based on exhausting the person who's on trial. Even though this entire 10 years he was in under trial, he writes about being treated as though he was already a convicted terrorist. His lawyer visits were restricted. His phone access was revoked. His book explains how collective punishment is normalized in Indian prisons and rights are eroded all the time. So, the question that any one of us would ask would be, how did a man like this survive for 10 years in a system like that? His environment wasn't a neat separation of political prisoners or criminal prisoners. Everything was just mixed in the Indian jails where he was taken. So he talks about how all the cells were overcrowded. All the inmates were packed in a can like sardines. He talks about how the conditions in prisons are so bad and violence is done on prisoners all the time, not only by each other, but also sometimes by staff. Sometimes brutality is outsourced, and so is discipline. He also talks about moments of tenderness and solidarity, times when all these prisoners would share food, small kindnesses where they would converse with each other and informally teach each other things. They would have sometimes great intellectual conversations amongst each other whenever they were given the chance to talk. He says that it was these chats among prisoners which led to his human survival and became his coping mechanism for those 10 years. This is one of the ways in which he could preserve his sanity. Kobad spent almost his entire 10 years reading and writing and practicing yoga. He knew that the only way he would survive the ordeal of Indian prisons was to focus on his mental discipline. So his brain and his mind became the only fortress with which he could stand against the prison system. After being in Indian prisons for 10 years, Kobad Gandhi was eventually released in late 2019, and shortly after he was released, the pandemic hit. By this time, this was a man in his 70s, a gentleman who his entire life had shunned wealth, had shunned luxury. When he eventually returned to his small little life in Bombay, thanks to his sister and his supporters, one of the things that this man in his advanced age had to worry about is how is he going to put food on his table. That's when he was approached to write this book, which I will link in the description box below. So this was the book that I was discussing. It's called Fractured Freedom. If you're interested, for your own edification, you want to know more about the Indian prison system, or at least how it worked when Kobad Gandhi was around, I urge you to buy this book. I'll leave a link in the description box below. Having said that, of course, all my narrative was based on information that I've gathered from the sources on the internet and from this book. If you think my understanding of this man is completely wrong, feel free to write that in the comment. Feel free to explain to me how you believe that this man and the life that he has led has been wrong and why he was rightly incarcerated, if that's what you think. I look forward to your comments in the A 25-minute video, of course, is not going to do justice to a couple who have been nothing but badasses their whole life and have worked for the poor. So this was just my way of introducing something that most of us are not familiar with, which is how the Indian jails work, how somebody is treated when they're under trial. I think all of us always have this illusion about the legal system, it's in fact a justice system. And I think if we take anything away from this video, we will definitely take away this kernel of truth that there is no such thing as a justice system. There might be such a thing as a legal system. Anyway, so definitely I'm not doing justice to their amazing life. I think that's why you should go ahead and buy this book. But until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.